Excellent. So I am going to give the fastest and certainly incomplete introduction to accessibility. There's so much to know about it, so much to learn, but we're going to try to get you started off so that you have some shared language for our discussion today and just have some basic understanding. But who am I and why am I talking about this? My name is Sara Kobilka, and I am the owner and principal consultant for Renaissance Women Consulting. I see a number of familiar names on here. I have worked with CSCCE before on the Community Profiles project. So I had the honor of interviewing Rebecca as one of the people in my work with that project, but many of the people on this call, I've gotten to learn about your community. My background, well, first, I've worked in a lot of industries and disciplines. So my tagline for my company is cross-pollinating impactful ideas across industries and disciplines, because there's so much great work going on out there. But those, you all know, working in the STEM field, that oftentimes you have those silos, those separations, and why reinvent the wheel, recreate things when there's really great ideas happening. And because I have a background in a lot of different industries, I am able to share what I'm learning from these different communities. I have experience in science education, both in the formal and informal realm, from preschool all the way through college. I also have a degree in journalism and atmospheric science, was a TV meteorologist for a while. I've worked at numerous universities in their science outreach departments and at science museums and nonprofits. So I've moved around, done a lot of things, and had a great time getting to learn about the work, amazing work that's going on in so many different fields. One thing that I really focus on, which is one of the things that I really find valuable about being part of the Slack channel and the conversations that are happening in the CSCCE, is really keeping diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, access, accessibility, and justice at the heart of my work. And I don't have any nice acronym for that, because each of those things is its own distinct thing, and I like to be explicit about it. The accessibility part of my work actually has really increased specifically in the last 2 years. So I have recently learned, I would not necessarily call myself a full expert on it, but I've recently learned a lot about it, in particular with some projects that I've been doing. So I can still remember what it's like to not know this stuff. I'm closer to where many of you might be, of just kind of starting to feel this out. I want to take a second at the beginning and just do a quick meta step back to tell you about this presentation. So I designed this presentation in PowerPoint, and I really wanted to think about making it as accessible as possible. So when you're looking at templates within PowerPoint, you can do a search for the word accessibility. And here you can see in this description that this is listed as being an accessible template. It's always best to start with something that is accessible, a template that's accessible, then you can make the modification. Retrofitting is always going to take more time and more effort than just starting with accessibility from the very beginning. But warning, I got this template, ran the accessibility checker, and it was not fully accessible. So it's not a guaranteed that it's 100% good. There were still modifications I had to make. So one of the biggest opportunities that I've had, which happened just last year, starting in October and going through December, to learn about accessibility, was that I responded to an RFP from the Association of Science and Technology Centers, where they said they wanted to create an accessibility toolkit, because science museums, because of COVID, had moved into more virtual, in fact, all virtual programming for a certain time period, and didn't really know what tools are out there. What do we know? How do we do this type of thing? So in less than 2 months, we put together a toolkit. I knew that I did not know enough about accessibility to successfully design this myself. So I reached out to a friend of a friend on LinkedIn. Her name is Meryl Evans. She is one of LinkedIn's top disability awareness experts, great person to follow. She has her website as well. I'm going to be talking about her quite a bit. And you can see on her shirt her message, which is progress over perfection. And we're going to be emphasizing that a lot. There is so much you can do with accessibility, but really what we want to focus on is just getting better each and every day. So here's our accessibility 101 Starting off, I want to talk a little bit about some of the numbers when it comes to accessibility, types of disability, and then some language around it. I will note that what I'm going to be presenting is very US centric because that is where I am located. And if other people have different experiences from the countries that they're located in or have lived in, I would encourage you to chime in with your perspective as well. And I'll try to point out when I have a more international perspective on things. But in terms of the numbers, 10% of the world's population, or roughly 650 million people, have a disability according to the WHO. And here in the United States, 1 out of every 4 adults has a disability. If you think about it, if you live to be a certain ripe old age, as they say, you will develop a disability at some point in time at the end of your life. And we come into this world not very able to do much of anything as well. So when you're talking about doing things to serve people, to make your communities more inclusive spaces, there are a lot of people who have disabilities that you can be supporting better. So it's not this just small group of people. And note that some of those disabilities are visible disabilities. In this image, you can see that the person is riding on one of those motorized scooters, but it isn't always one of those, it isn't always a visible thing, and people aren't even always going to tell you that they might have a disability. So for the purposes of that toolkit, and this is pulled directly from the toolkit, these icons that you see here are used throughout the toolkit to talk about these strategies that we suggest and the tools that we suggest to use, which of the different types of disabilities that they support. You have your visual disabilities, the typical ones we think of, blindness, low vision, color blindness, those types of things, but a scratched cornea, a dilated eye, all of those can make it more difficult to see. Auditory, we're talking about deafness, hard of hearing, auditory processing disorders. Speech is something that we need to be considering when we're talking about engaging with our community members. Non-speaking, stuttering, Tourette syndrome. I'm going to jump down 5, mobility. When we're talking about virtual engagement, really where the biggest mobility issues tend to be with the weakness or limitations of the arms, hands, fingers, or other body parts. And note that it can impact 3 different things: mobility, dexterity, or stamina. We have the picture of the person in the wheelchair, but the wheelchair isn't necessarily going to have the impact on the virtual engagement the way that something with an arm, hands, or fingers, or even neck might have. And then the 4th list is cognitive and neurodiversity. When we're talking about cognitive and neurodiversity, we need to be cognizant of the fact that not every person who is neurodivergent.
Perfect. So as I was just mentioning, when it comes to neurodiversity and people who are who fall into that category, they don't always consider themselves as a person with a disability. So we do need to be aware of language and that it is different between different groups of people who are impacted by the accessibility efforts that an organization might do. And again, this image is pulled directly from the toolkit. So moving on to the next slide, we're going to be talking about a number of features with regards to accessibility, and one of them is language. The most important thing to think about when you're talking about language is to be flexible and respectful. Note that it is something that is constantly changing. What was good today might not be the best idea for tomorrow. So staying aware of the conversations that are happening, know that you will make mistakes as well as you're talking about things. As you're talking, one of the most important things to think about is the term disability and disabled. And a lot of times people are afraid to use those terms, and so they kind of work their way around it by talking about differently abled people, or in the K-12 realm in the United States, we often hear the term special needs. For the adult disabled community, that is offensive. They don't want you to be scared of the term disabled or disability. So use that term. It is fine. How you put that together when describing a person, though, is something that you need to think about. So there's two different ways that you can describe someone. You can do the person first description, which is a person who is deaf, emphasizing person because it comes first, or the identity first. So a deaf person, and this is someone who identifies as deaf. That's a real huge part of who they are. And so there have been changes in recent years as to what is recommended in terms of person first versus identity first. Different groups feel differently about it. So what is best to do is to find out from individuals how they want to be referred to. That's the simplest thing. Just ask people, do you prefer person first or identity first? If you are not able to find that out, if your organization is just reaching out and you don't know who's going to get the information you're sharing, just be consistent. Pick one, stick with it until someone lets you know that they would like you to change for themselves. And if you'd like to stay up to date and really dig into language around disability, the National Center on Disability and Journalism has an excellent style guide. There's a link in this PowerPoint presentation, but I also put that in the resources in the February 2023 CSCCE Community Call notes. So you can find a link to that. So second thing to say about language is that ableist language is deeply, deeply embedded in the language that we use every single day. Saying, as you can see when you're doing a presentation, the expert blind spot, we like to talk about that in science communication a lot. It's fallen on deaf ears. OCD. They made such a dumb choice, or, oh, my life is so crazy right now. These are all things that I know I have said in the past, and I'm quite tempted to say, in particular, the last bullet point, because of how my life feels a bit out of control. I have two very small children. So these are all examples of ableist language, and language that tells someone who might be blind, who might be deaf, who might be diagnosed with a neurological disorder or anything like that, oh, maybe you don't really belong in this space. These are really hard to stop yourself from saying. I am doing it on a daily basis, trying to catch myself as I'm using this particular language, especially things, the use of the word crazy or things related to crazy. It's hard, but it is, again, another step that you can do for yourself personally to really try to think. We know that language is so important when we're talking about these topics. So really thinking about that. And going along with language, if you haven't already noticed, the images that you use in your presentations send a message too of who belongs here, who's included in this community. This particular image comes from Disability In, and I put the link to this resource. It's a place where you can go to find stock photos of people with disabilities. Yes, dumbing down is another SciComm favorite of language that is ableist. So there are a couple of different resources that I listed where you can find diverse images to include in your presentations to, again, just make people feel more included. So moving on, and I'm almost to the point where I'm going to be able to share in just a second, but first I want to talk about this chart here. So there's a slight difference between this chart and the one that I showed from our toolkit. Touch is represented here, whereas we talk about mobility. But these are examples when you're talking about disabilities. There are permanent disabilities, temporary, and situational disabilities. The first thing I want to say about what you're seeing here is that this is not meant to equate a situational disability with a permanent disability. So yes, I had small children and I had to carry around a baby and push a stroller. That does not mean that those few months that I was carrying a baby and pushing a stroller, that I totally have an understanding of what it means to be in a wheelchair or to be born with one arm. So we're not making that equation between a situational experience and a permanent experience. Instead, what this is meant to show is that when you make these accessibility efforts in the work that you're doing, and you are doing something that would support someone with a permanent disability, there are other people who are going to benefit from it. So in particular, because I know a lot of you are working with international groups, in the column speak, the second column from the right, there is a person who might be nonverbal, that's a permanent. There could be somebody with laryngitis, COVID, all the great diseases going around. But then there's also people who have heavy accents. And all of those people can benefit from the accessibility efforts that you put in to serve someone who is nonverbal. And this is taken from Merrill's website, but this is originally created, and because I'm looking at my phone, I can't even read the font, but by an organization in Sweden listed on the lower right-hand side, and they repurposed something that was created by Microsoft. So you might have seen a similar type of icon before. So moving on to the next slide, and after this slide, I'll probably be able to get my PowerPoint actually up and running. There we go. So we're going to talk about communication in particular with accessibility. This is another one of those image sources, disabled and here, for getting some really great diverse representation in the images, the stock images that you use. So as we're talking about accessible communication, Katie mentioned before she's going to be walking you through some readability checkers that can help with readability of the content that you're creating. It's really important to write in plain language. We're talking with the scientific community, so a certain level of jargon might come into the picture just because, but oftentimes if you're working with scientists who are in two different fields, a biologist and a chemist, the jargon of biology is not the same as the jargon of chemistry. And so when you focus on minimizing those terms that people might not know, reducing the number of acronyms, or if you're using acronyms, always define them, those types of things can be really valuable to serve all people. You may have a PhD in one field, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you know the jargon of another field. And so, next step in terms of readability is to think about the formatting of what you create. We like to make things really fancy. We like to maybe put in all sorts of little bold and italics and emoticons and all these different things, including in our social media posts that we make. The more that you put in fancy things, the more difficult it is for people to read. So keeping it simple is really important. And Meryl talks about that on her website if you need advice. And then being aware of our use of colors. I'm not sure if Katie's going to be showing this, but color checkers are available for the resources that you have, your websites, your PDFs, your documents that you create. And even just knowing about the psychology of color and how the color red attracts one's eyes. So using that kind of knowledge to know that if you put a ton of bright red, that could actually be really distracting for people and draw their eyes away from the information that you are trying to share with them. So using tools to check for that. When I get to the end of my presentation, if there's time, I plan to show you the toolkit, the tool types that we have in that document that I created for ASTC. And it's really helpful because you can see the different types of challenges that you might have, and then the tools that are available out there to actually check for them. They don't catch everything, but it is good to use some of them. Okay, so hashtags, that's another thing that we all love to do. Hashtags are fun for social media, but one of the most important things, and this is, again, if you want something that you can walk away from today, the change that you can make and not right away is capitalizing the first letter of every word in your hashtag. So Pascal case, both the P and the C are capitalized, or every word that comes after the first, which is camel case. If you think about it, camel has humps. So the lowercase c on camel, but then the capital C on case. And reason why, I'm going to let Katie pull up, click one time for me, Katie. There we go. Everyone take a look. I'm not going to read it out loud. This is a real hashtag that was used. And we click one more time to see what it was supposed to be. That may not have been where your brain went. And then one more click shows us that, oh, everybody's favorite Susan Boyle. This is where it came from. It lives in infamy for accessibility. That Susan had an album coming out. She wanted to promote her new album. I've read some places like, was this actually done sneakily to try to get more attention? My guess is they probably just messed up and didn't really think about what would their hashtag look like in all lowercase and how might people read it, but it lives long in infamy. Alt text, that is another thing that you can pretty easily do. It's not quite as super simple. It takes a little bit more work than making your hashtags, but it does have an option for you. And what I'm going to do really quickly is I'm going to switch back to running this on my laptop. So Katie, I'm going to quickly sign out of my cell phone for the Zoom meeting because I'm also starting to get a little echo.
Okay, can everybody see and hear me? Beautiful. As I think I maybe mentioned at the beginning, I used to be on TV. I was a TV meteorologist, so having technology hate me is something I've had on live TV many times. So I'm not totally thrown off by it. Okay, so continuing, there's that Susan's album party. So the alt text, you want to use that for all images that you have, in particular, if you're sending it out through your organization's social media. If you're doing personally and you're dropping 40 photos of you and your family on vacation, maybe you don't need to do that. But really, when you're representing your organization, it is really important. This needs to be the case in all documents that you create, your presentations that you have. There are instances, and Maya's going to talk probably about this in hers, about PowerPoint. You can mark something as being decorative, so you don't have to describe every single thing that is being shown on the screen. When you do write those alt texts for your images, make sure to be descriptive but concise. They're not meant to be a giant paragraph. Different platforms have different requirements in terms of how long they can be. You can find that information online. Another thing that I see people doing is that they create these PDFs or a JPEG of an entire event invitation. It's beautiful and all that sort of thing. And then they post that and they don't post anything else. And if you're using a screen reader and there's no alt text, you're not invited to the party because you cannot read any of that information. A screen reader cannot just see a JPEG and immediately pull the text that is in that JPEG to let a person know what's going on. So if you do create that, make sure that you put all of the text information that a person needs to know from that image in some other sort of way, whether it's an alt text or whether you actually put that into your post or some other place. So the next thing we're going to talk about is PDF files. As Katie mentioned at the beginning, making a PDF file accessible is very challenging. It is not completely impossible, but they're notorious for not being accessible. And yes, that includes Canva. Canva is a very challenging, difficult output to actually make accessible. One of the links that I put to in our doc is something that actually shows you a YouTube channel of a gentleman who makes all these YouTube videos, and he has a number of videos about how to make PDF files accessible, but it is a very lengthy process. And in some cases, if you have something that you really need to be high quality, you may need to hire somebody who's an expert to make it accessible. And what do you do about that? Well, consider sharing things another way. So you might have a PDF file, but is it something that you created maybe as can you pull the information that you need from it and put it in a Google Doc that's view only, or some other sort of way so that if it's really has important information in it, that people can get that information. We have events oftentimes for our communities, and maybe we have a registration form for the events. We need to make sure that that registration form is accessible. There are a number of things you can do to test for accessibility of websites. Katie might talk about them, but if it's a form where there's a lot of things that you need to fill in, you can do a tab test. Can you navigate the entire form just by using your keyboard on a computer. If you can't use touchscreen, if you can't use a mouse, can you just tab, 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 tab and jump between the fields and fill it out? Or do you get stuck at some point in time? Can you minimize the amount of information that you're collecting from people so that you don't cause cognitive overload? Can they save it in the middle if they need to go gather information to include in it, or if they get distracted? So there's a number of things. Again, we have more details in what we've put together in the toolkit. And then finally, just have multiple ways for people to reach out for help. I don't think this is really an issue that most of you will be dealing with, but if people only list, for example, a phone number to call if you have problems, if you are a person who is deaf, you have no way to get any sort of help. So an email address plus another way to reach out for assistance can be really valuable for people. And then videos and audio, make sure to create captions and note that they are different from subtitles. And I know in different countries, some countries, captions and subtitles, the terms are just used as being synonymous, but they're not. You do want captions, and closed captions are the best, because versus open captions, closed captions, the person has a choice to turn them on or off. And as you might already have seen within Zoom, you can have Zoom create captions for you. So that's really great. And then there's something else called a transcript. Transcripts can be created from captions. Captions show a very small amount of information at a time. You have 1 or 2 lines showing up on the screen, whereas transcripts showing a larger amount. So if a person maybe is reading more slowly, has dyslexia, different things, the transcript could be helpful. And transcripts for example, a podcast are really great, because I listen to a lot of podcasts and I want to go back and reference things from them. But if there's no transcript, I'd have to listen to the entire podcast to find that comment or that book that they mentioned or something like that. So having a transcript means it's a searchable thing now. And as Meryl always says, as her church said, it's about progress over perfection. And I think I'm running low on time, so I'm just going to wrap it up at this point and say that if you have questions, you can reach out to me. The QR code takes you to LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn a lot, or you can find me in Slack.